Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
Hamatak Yapi, good morning. Good morning, Adnan.
Good morning. Great to see you. Salam.
It's really good to see you. This is a good day for a kind of conversation like this. This is something that you and I have been sort of talking about back and forth for a little bit. How to approach this topic in a scholarly but also a critical way, especially in this moment in time. But before we get into these conversations, maybe we should just spend a little time introducing ourselves to each other. We have different, there's a lot of crossover with what we do, but also that we have different audiences and different expertise in different fields. So I'll turn it over to you if you want to talk about a little bit about your work, who you are, and your platform.
Oh, great. I'm Adnan Hussein, and I'm a medieval historian, a medieval Mediterranean and Islamicate world. What does that mean? The Mediterranean in the pre-modern period, and I focus and specialize on Muslim, Christian, and Jewish interactions, intersections, kind of coexistence in mixed societies of the Mediterranean, as well as the kind of wars like the Crusades and so on. And One of the areas that I focus on is on religious culture. And I've done a lot of work in the past on Muslim mystical and spiritual traditions, and particularly more recently thinking about how they can become bases for social and then ultimately political power. And so that's kind of what brings me to this today. And I talk about all these kinds of things, but also a lot of more modern and contemporary histories, religion, and politics together, and overlapping. And I have a series, in addition to the ones that are on history and contemporary politics, and live streams on those topics, panel shows, office hours, these kinds of things for audience interaction. I also have a series that I've just started called The Names of God, which is about kind of understanding at least one particular form of Muslim spiritual orientation and how that might be understood and adapted as part of a kind of self-discipline, psychological kind of strengthening and resources for people involved in, the more political and active struggles that, I'm interested in fostering with and kind of promoting and getting engaged in. And I do that with a friend and a colleague who's a phenomenological psychologist. And so we have dialogues about these kinds of things coming up, exploring the tradition of the 99 names of God, and hopefully expanding to include other traditions where there is some kind of names of God and what they mean and what they do, for people. So that's me. And maybe I should ask you, Nick, especially for my listeners, to introduce yourself.
You're also the co-host of Guerrilla History.
Oh, that's right. I forgot. I'm the co-host. I've got all these different things going on. Yes, co-host of Guerrilla History. Please check that out as well.
Yeah, that's where we initially met. I think you all invited me on the show to discuss my book,
Yes.
Our History is the Future. And I think we even talked a little bit about this topic. But you are also have been a guest in the past on the Red Nation podcast, which I'm a co-host of. And I think you talked about the culture of conquest and really going back and into the origins of this, the origins and the foundation of what we know as manifest destiny and possibly, Zionism today, or U.S. imperialism in general. And right now I'm, speaking to you from our platform, Red Scare, which is just a side project I'm doing. I'm still doing, co-hosting 100% on Red Nation podcast, but this is sort of more my interests, kind of specific to Red Scare has many meanings. It's, the first Red Scare is Native people named in the Declaration of Indian Independence. No, I was going to say Independence, Declaration of Independence, as merciless Indian savages, is spelled out by Thomas Jefferson. I argue that that's the first Red Scare. The United States was founded on the elimination of Native people as a threat. Our sovereignty has always been posed as a threat, and since then, that has moved on to other sort of enemies of empire, then being, the communist Red Scare, etc. But also, I really like horror movies,
Hmm.
and so, and so there's also this element of doing. Sina and I did an episode on They Live, which isn't really a horror movie so much as a sci-fi kind of dystopian movie, but nonetheless, I really love horror movies. I love the horror genre. I want to do some more film analysis on that. So this is just a project for that. It's also a research, a research kind of notes Substack where I write about writing. That's something that I'm always interested in, and I encourage a lot of my students and comrades to really engage in. Even if you're not writing for an audience, what it really inspires you to write every day. I'm posting on that. I think in the future I'm going to be posting some of the research that I've done around Freedom of Information Act files that I've obtained and have filed on Native activists in the United States, but also in Canada. There's a lot of overlap there, and so there's some cool ones that I got that I just need to write up like little brief reports. Some of them are quite fascinating in terms of how long this kind of surveillance and counterinsurgency campaign has been waged against American Indian social movements in the United States. Oftentimes we kind of think about it as the American Indian movement and the so-called COINTELPRO program that subverted them. But really, as we'll talk about today, this goes back to the 19th century. And even in the early 19th century, when Native people were seen as sort of the nadir of their population decline. Um, and even at this point in time, as we'll talk about in the ghost dance, and I'll be upfront with you, and this maybe will be, I'm also, sorry, I just got tenure in American Indian Studies.
Congratulations. Wonderful.
Yeah. At the University of Minnesota, where I teach full time. I'm really invested in the field of American Indian Studies. I'm a historian by training, but I've always, gone to American Indian Studies conferences, and yeah, so it's really near and dear to my heart. But just to kind of kick off this discussion, you and I were sort of emailing back and forth about this, and I'll start with sort of my position as a scholar, but also as somebody who is engaged actively in these struggles and has been sort of a participant in them. Um, I typically don't publicly talk about spirituality, indigenous spirituality, and more specifically Lakota spirituality to non-indigenous audiences. I call it the flute and drums effect. As soon as you start talking about that, it's like the flute and drums start playing in people's ears, and they literally they can't hear anything else you're saying, right? So mine has been really my approach has been really sort of grounded in a political analysis, especially when I'm giving, like public lectures or talks or rally speech or whatever it is. Um, but if you read my book, I do get into some of these elements, and it's actually something I've been exploring more as I um, become more confident to talk about it. I think, of course, I'm a practitioner, whatever that means. I think for us, there isn't really, at least the way I've been taught, there isn't really a separation between the knowledges and the sort of traditions of resistance and what we now know as like spirituality, right? Even that term spirituality, I think it attempts to sort of, and maybe you have a little bit more sort of knowledge and perspective on this, but I think it attempts to distance itself from like religion, which kind of comes out of like an organized sense. But then it also has this other element where it's like everyone's like, I have an individual spirituality, right? And so many people encounter um, indigenous spirituality through consumption, right? And there's a variety of ways. I'll confess I've watched episodes of like reality television where people are like saging their houses, like they're doing this thing, and like sage has become very smudging has become very sort of
Yes.
predominant.
Mm.
There's that sort of more, I guess, innocent, I would say, aspect of it. And then there's a more kind of extreme aspect of it where you do have people who take indigenous medicines like peyote or ayahuasca and then commodify them and turn them into drugs. And we see this like happening a lot in like, in the sort of illicit drug trade. We also see it happening in the wellness community, people who are, legitimate psychologists and psychiatrists actually prescribing these drugs as sort of solutions to Western alienation. And I didn't really think about it until I went to Bolivia and experienced um, their sort of cultural revolution in bringing back indigenous lifeways. This was after the coup, and then the restoration of democracy. And it's poignant to talk about this because today, Bolivians are going to the polls or not going to the polls, depending on what political faction they've chosen. There's a power struggle going on in the presidential elections, but uh, bracket that aside, they have undergone this really kind of beautiful process of codifying and protecting indigenous medicines and
Mm.
spiritual and cultural practices. And one of them is ayahuasca. We see they call it narco tourism. Oftentimes, the levy against people like Evo Morales and the MAS, the movement towards socialism, is that they're essentially cocaine traffickers. They traffic in coca because coca was, is a very foundational sort of medicine within their community or within their nation. Has been turned into a drug because of Western imperialism. What was fascinating, what they were talking about, is actually they're trying to keep Westerners out and away from these medicines because they turn them into drugs, given the history of the coca plant, which is sacred to them. I saw, and experienced and participated in some of those ceremonies in which they honor this coca leaf, and it's also like integrated into their everyday culture. They drink it as a tea, they're chewing it on the streets, and it's also, it has this kind of medicinal purpose of the high altitude. It opens up their blood vessels, etc. And now we see this kind of influx of Westerners looking to Bolivia as another sort of extractive zone for ayahuasca, right? And you have these kind of like hippie people kind of going in, probably some maybe with good intentions to participate and imbibe this drug and hallucinate. Um, and it's created a lot of problems for local communities. There's an influx of outsiders. They're turning it into a drug. It's taking it out of that context, and then all of a sudden, it's just reproducing the same sort of colonial extractive model. And one of my very, very good friends who actually works in the Ministry of Ancestral Medicines, Vivi Camacho, explained to me in detail what this looks like and why they're creating these sort of regulations around it. And it was a very powerful experience because she said, we don't have the sort of kind of we don't have the kind of alienation that the Western world has. She was a trained surgeon. She went to Belgium and lived as a surgeon. She's a Quechua indigenous woman. And she said one of the most depressing things for her was to encounter the high rates of death by suicide
Yeah.
that happened in the Western world, and then understanding that in the context of the United States. And she was very clear. Says you're like, people say, yes, you live in material wealth, but why is it that you have so much alienation, social alienation, through and spiritual alienation through death by suicide, depression, drug use, all of these things. And she's like, you do have a struggle. That's a class struggle that the West needs to wage. And actually, she really put it into perspective. And she's like, what happens is they'll try, to turn to a quick fix. Like you can take a drug as if that's going to solve all your problems. And also it assumes that there isn't an exploitative or coercive relationship, that these things are just for the consumption of everyone. Right. So there was this aspect of spirituality for me. I think that, I'm going to like these kind of very extreme cases, but it's also why I personally am a little bit reserved in how I talk about it, because I do think that turns into sort of a fetishistic thing. It's either denied outright as sort of a primitive, you know, religion, a pagan. I've heard these terms even growing up. People would say things like that. Even some of my own family would say things like that because of the introduction of Christianity and colonization. But I think wholly it's been depoliticized purposefully. And I think the reading that I shared with you is from a book by Jeffrey Osler, who's a white historian who kind of writes about the ghost dance movement in the 19th century, specifically among the Lakotas or the Ochete Shakoi, and how it wasn't just a kind of depoliticized movement or spiritual practice, but it was very politically charged in the context of this very brutal, crackdown on the reservation system, mass population decline because of centuries of war, disease, etc. You go from a population. I'll get into this a little bit more, but you go to a population in North America of 8 to 10 million people, of American Indian people, to around 250,000 around 1890, the year that the ghost dance really takes hold, right? And that's the lowest the population has ever been, and it hasn't ever recovered. We've never recovered our population in that context. So I think it's this movement arises in this kind of really dark period, and I think it's worth studying. And I think even at the time that it's sort of brought back in the 20th century, and during the Red Power movement, is also a time of struggle, right? And that's what I'm interested in, because I saw when I opened the doors or they opened the doors to me as a guest to their cultural ministry in La Paz in Bolivia. I saw just this honoring of the 32 indigenous nations or peoples that live there, and that was the norm, right? That wasn't it wasn't the sort of like, oh, there's like the European Bolivian history, and then we kind of have like like they do in the United States. It was a true expression of plurinationalism. That you can have many different peoples make up a nation, right? That there is room for these sorts of differences, and you can work those things out in a way, and we just don't have that. And what I would call the monoculture of like secular Western liberalism. There's no allowance for it, and when it does appear, it has to appear as something that's aberrant or romanticized, right? And I think that really kind of there's a lot of parallels, and I'll turn it over to you a little bit because you're the expert, you're the guy who actually studies these religion and everything. But yeah, those are kind of my initial thoughts on this particular topic.
Yeah, really interesting and stimulating to hear this analysis and perspective across a range, really, of issues, it seems to me. And I want to start with that first one about reluctance to really talk about it as spirituality, or to really engage in discussing it through that prism for an audience that is outside. And of course, this is a function, as you were pointing out, of particular experience and history of settler colonialism, um, that gives it a particular meaning, for all these appropriative misunderstandings, misuses, and exploitation of it, as well as you were saying, some kind of remedy for whatever's wrong with Western or American consumer capitalist culture. So that's an angle at which from which I'm very sympathetic of the critique, because the way in which most people in the West know about or have heard about the Muslim traditions. And I would, again, I would say I don't know what else to call it when I'm teaching. I don't necessarily call it spirituality as a final term. I say, these are devotional currents, these are pietistic orientations and practices. They're mystical yearnings and vocabularies. And the reason why is because the way in which most people in the West have heard about tasawwuf, which is the Arabic and Islamicate word for this tradition and current, um, that we call Sufism in a kind of westernized language, is as spirituality, and it plays into a number of things. One is there's an Orientalist dimension that approaches Sufism as somehow not Islam. Muslims may be doing it, but it's not Islam. It's because Islam is a particular kind of religion. And it's, again, the boundaries and divisions between what's religion and what's spirituality. Spirituality is something related, it's much more close to Christianity, which is, of course, a religion, but it's a spiritual religion, whereas Judaism and Islam are religions of the law. And in medieval times up to the present, polemics against Islam and Judaism in the Christian intellectual and theological imagination was that they were carnal religions that only dealt with the body, regulating the body, but there was no spirit in them. You're right. And you can think of going back to Paul the apostle's letters, that the spirit, the letter killeth, that is the letter of the law, whereas the spirit gives life. And this is what was to distinguish this new religious movement that we now call Christianity from its origin kind of religious culture of Judaism. And so it has a particular cast. It was yoked in this Christian imagination with Orientalism about some peoples of the East being spiritual people. What was good about them was that they didn't have a religious law that conflicted with the priorities of colonial governance. And so, it played a certain role even in the colonial process, in the Orientalist imagination, the way they understood the East, and particularly Islam. And so they imagined that this tradition somehow came from either Eastern Christians in the Near East, and or from Hindu and Buddhist traditions, and that as Islam and Muslims you know, expanded in the cultural and territorial geographic zones, that they just absorbed these traditions that are extraneous to Islam and couldn't be, part of its tradition in an authentic sort of way. So there's been a delegitimization of it from this Western kind of perspective, that you can have Sufism or Muslim spirituality without it being Muslim. And so there's the whole appropriation of many of the great spiritual masters who may have talked in a language about transcending religious identity differences to a higher truth, that spirit, a spiritual reality that is found in all pathways to ultimate cosmic truth. And this kind of mystical language is then seen to legitimize the idea that this isn't really Islam, and you could just practice and engage with Sufism, much like the drugs, the drugification, of um, use of peyote, or other indigenous coca, all the things that you were talking about, stripped of and outside the context of the traditions, the life ways, the social environment, the imaginative kind of context in which people use these, and what kinds of experience they want out from them, and what that means. All of that is stripped away. Um, and similarly, Sufism was, again, something that, like, kind of on the starting in the 19th century with these spiritualist movements that discovered the wisdom of the East and the spirituality of the East. You have a whole series up to the hippies and so on, of Westerners appropriating these traditions to be a remedy for whatever ills they felt in terms of alienation and dissatisfaction with the consumer culture of the West. So there is, like, this something a little similar, but it's less a product of the kind of genocidal violence that we see, happening in powerful settler colonial context, like we are speaking of in Turtle Island. So um, I guess the other thing that I would say about this is that, in the process of anti-imperialist modernization, there was a real religious ferment taking place in the 18th and 19th centuries in Islamic Kate lands, and lands where there were large Muslim populations and where there might have been, Muslim rulers and states that had existed for some time. There was a real religious ferment taking place, and usually it's characterized as this kind of rise of this Salafist or Wahhabi ideology as a kind of radical reformist tradition that sought to modernize Islam in some ways by getting rid of um, backward features and characteristics of, Muslim religious practice and superstition, shrine visitation, thaumaturgic things, using amulets and prayers and things like this was all seen as totally, holding, Muslims back and as extraneous to authentic early Islam. And so we had to purge and purify Islam in order to, contend with and confront the realities of, modernity, or in rejection of modernity. Either way, there was this kind of reformist sort of spirit and tradition, which is what has led to what we think of as the, modern dissident movements against U.S. empire, but have also been used by U.S. empire, as we know, the jihadist groups, and so on. And so there's this kind of way in which, even for me talking about, and it used to be, even in diasporic Muslim communities, in the United States, to talk about Sufism or Tasawwuf would make you anathematized in those communities, because it was really part of what was being suppressed and purged. And in the era of the globalization of this Wahhabi Salafist ideology, particularly through the patronage, sponsorship, and money of like the oil monarchies, especially Saudi, this became, what people thought orthodoxy was, right? Whereas the historic traditions of Tasawwuf in the pre-modern period and up to like the 19th century, you would say that almost everybody had some contact with tasawwuf in one form or another, either because they adhered to it as a very disciplined practice and joined a spiritual brotherhood, the tariqas, as they're known, a kind of organization. Sometimes they're called Sufi orders or brotherhoods. Um, uh, or just because that it was just part of their devotional culture in a very diffuse way. It was just part and parcel of what it meant and what was experienced as being Muslim. But in the 19th century, in the 20th century, this changed, and people don't really remember that it was so widespread. And it was seen as like heretical or superstitious or, contrary to a new idea of orthodoxy. So there's a number of ways in which this kind of question of spirituality is of great kind of concern. But I think the one thing that's so fascinating and forgotten in these, histories is that, just as you were talking about with the ghost dance and the movement around it, um, and we'll get into, more detailed discussion of it, but I would say that there is actually a long history, not the way we think of spirituality as withdrawal from the world, as a way of avoiding, kind of engagement with the world, kind of mystification of it and withdrawal and depoliticizing, which is also how it has come to be understood so much in this new revival of it. Okay, so because in the last 20, 30 years or so, there has been a shift where it's now more acceptable. And part of it, of course, emerged in the post 9/11 period, because Sufis could be the good Muslims because they're depolitical, they're spiritual, and they don't, subscribe to this Wahhabi Salafist sort of ideology. And so there was a way in which it was seen as an antidote in some ways. And that has also been a way for Muslims in diasporic contexts dealing with, Islamophobia, the atmosphere of being questioned in all ways, as a result of the global war on terror, um, to perhaps find a way or a new vocabulary to uh, make being Muslim somehow okay in the political context of the West. And so a lot of that has been framed around, and some of the people who are the biggest promoters of it in, Western diasporic Muslim culture, and who are taken as like leaders of the Muslim community, are actively depoliticizing and have discouraged, in fact, even, people from doing pro-Palestine solidarity now, for example, and this kind of thing. And so, for across a range of experiences, it's now seen perhaps as a more acceptable way of being Muslim in this context. But quite opposed to that kind of recent reappropriation of tasawwuf as spirituality. Uh, that I'm finding problematic, there is an incredible tradition. In fact, you would say the dominant anti colonial tradition in the Muslim world was actually based on Sufism and Sufi responses to colonialism, whether it's in West Africa, North Africa against the French, West Africa against the French and the British, in Southeast Asia, in the Caucasus against the Russian Empire, in the Southeast Asia, in the 19th century, and in Southeast Asia against the Dutch, against the British. So that's a kind of tradition that seems worth recapturing, in this moment. And so that's the kind of thing I'm interested in thinking with you about. Um, and that article that you mentioned, um, made some connections that I thought were really great, and referring to scholarship about prophets of rebellion. You can think of the Mahdi in Sudan against the British, taking place, and you can think of people like Emir Abdul Qadir, who fought against the French, or Sheikh Shamil in the Caucasus. Um, as kind of and they're often the messianic kind of language that is invoked as being other examples of prophets of rebellion, and in some ways, so it's like it was a useful category to think about what happens to resist, what kinds of religion of resistance emerge at different times in history and in different conditions. And of course they can become quietistic, but they can also turn, into radical political action at the time. And that's a kind of interesting question about what has to happen, for that transformation, to take place, or what are the features of resistant religion, or what I would want to talk about, today is like, what's the religion of Gazans? I mean,
Yeah, those are some really excellent points. I think several things that resonate. When you're talking about this kind of time period in which there's a transformation, and it's both internal and external. It's responding to these external pressures of like imperialism. I think that always has to be taken into account, because you do get in every society sort of reactionary or progressive or revolutionary or anti-colonial sort of reactions to this, and that these religions or spiritual movements often get categorized. And I think of the ghost dance because it's really fascinating. In James Mooney, his famous book, they call him an ethnologist. He wasn't an ethnologist. He wasn't trained in anything. He was just a lawyer. He was just some white guy from the East, right, who read some books and then kind of went in and studied this. They make it sound like he was some kind of like expert. He was just a random white dude. There was no field of ethnology, right? You just like made it up. He was literally an armchair, scholar. And he went in
I
and
like to think of
interviewed.
these guys as colonial scholars, because who
Yeah,
were the Orientalists? Right?
exactly.
The British Orientalists, they're just like some officer who's, in the British colonial administration, who's got some time on his hand and decides, oh, this is an interesting thing. Let me write a book on it and become the expert, and then go back home to the Royal Geographic Society or some other body and, give some talks about it. These are not professional in the academic sense that we know it today. But
Right.
yet, interestingly enough, all of these disciplines do develop and emerge out of that kind of a colonial intelligence, use of knowledge. So, um, they then, these early figures, they might be criticized by subsequent scholars because that's always the thing, is to say, well, my work is better. But I mean, really, their roots are with the same kind of colonial gaze, it seems to me.
Yeah, his book is it's turned into a book, but really it was just part of a series. If you ever read the book, it starts at like on like page 600, because it's the annals of like American ethnography or something like that, and it's an intelligence report. He goes and interviews some people. He kind of, it really reminds me of the prose of counterinsurgency, and he's trying to kind of create this idea about, he's doing kind of several things. He's saying, well, this is like every religion, every messianic movement. He compares it to Islam. He compares it to various kind of strands of Shakerism, of Protestantism, and then he's like, it was innocent in the sense that it was like, it didn't really advocate for violence, as if this is some kind of like marker that, every religion, because if Christianity was ever compared, it'd be like, yo, the book that you actually use is a book of genocide in many ways. By the way, we're doing an episode on that this Thursday. So but he does this thing where he says, he interviews Wovoka, who is the prophet of this religion, of this movement, and he's like very clear to say, he never advocated violence, and in fact, he's assimilated. He's a cut hair. He cut his hair. He's wearing a wide brim hat. He works for a white rancher. He's advocating for, industriousness, in very much, in many ways. The book is kind of making a case that Wovoka is, his name is Jack Wilson, is anything but this kind of radical, prophet of rebellion. Instead, he's an assimilationist, right? He's somebody who is in many ways embodies the Protestant work ethic. He's not even disavowing Christianity, right? He's actually, this is a way for Native people to embrace Christianity, and so he's doing this kind of cultural relativism thing. And then he says, but when it gets taken up in the context of, what he calls the Sioux or the Lakota, then it takes on hostile meaning. That's his quote, the hostile meaning. Like all of a sudden it becomes a violent sort of movement, or one in which that is confrontational. And I think we can see this actually, it's a really useful study in many ways, I think, to critically read it, because you can see the same thing happening right now, or even prior to October 7th, 2023, with this intensification of the genocide in Gaza, where there was this debate where it's like, we advocate for nonviolent, civil disobedience or resistance, right?
Yeah.
Anyone who engages in armed struggle is the bad Indian or the bad Palestinian. Anyone who engages in nonviolent resistance on the terms that we define is the good Indian, the good Palestinian. That's what Mooney was trying to do. He was trying to separate. He's doing this is a very colonial tactic. It's so wild that in 2023 we witnessed this tactic being imposed in real time, right? The active denunciations of armed resistance, the active denunciation of self-defense, right? And in this moment in time, like in the 1890s, it's also, he's doing this kind of like moralization of what is legitimate, spiritual practice, and what is illegitimate spiritual practice. There's a confluence of forces, right? And I thought that was just like really fascinating, because you talked about how these spiritual traditions arose in a way that wasn't a form of withdrawal, but it was active engagement with the world. And that's what I really see the Ghost Dance movement as, is it's very much an active engagement with the conditions. It was a response to the reservation order, right? It wasn't just something that just kind of like appeared out of perhaps there was a divine, I'm not doubting the divine sort of intervention, or the divine element there, but it also, this prophet appeared at a specific point in time, right, with this message, one that's, resonated, it's literally spread like wildfire, to the point that the United States sent half its standing army to the western states because they were afraid of an outbreak, of a massive kind of unified outbreak against, um, these territorial and state governments that were newly formed, jeopardizing the consolidation of the frontier, the final Indian War. And it was actually the final Indian War. It was the 14th battle streamer on the US Army flag, is actually, it's called the Pine Ridge Campaign. It was a campaign against the ghost dance, right? So not only were they deployed in what is, what was at the time, or they just formed as states. It was North Dakota and South Dakota. Federal troops were sent there, but they were also sent to other parts of the country, like Oklahoma, um, to Nevada, the southwestern states, fearing this, massive uprising. So that was really kind of fascinating about, how they're this wasn't just about withdrawal, and I think
Yeah.
that's what Mooney's trying to say. He's trying to say, oh, it's just it's a
Yeah.
harmless sort of thing. They're kind of lost in their own sort of, like, they're inward looking. They're just looking back at the past. And I think it also gets talked about, that the ghost dance gets talked about that way even today. It's just like, it's really unfortunate. We don't really understand why they ended up shooting everybody at Wounded Knee, and in December of 1890. It's just kind of like a misunderstanding, because these were just peaceful people. And what I think
That's the
Osler,
Yeah, go
what,
ahead.
go ahead. No, I think
I,
what Osler is trying to do in this piece, that in his book, is to actually show, like, this is a modern anti-colonial rebellion. They were they weren't just, it was spreading by word of mouth, yes, but it was also using trains to visit the prophet, to transcribe his message. These were trained, many of them were trained, they were literate because they went to boarding schools. They were not just transcribing it into English, they were transcribing it into Lakota. Lakota wasn't just an oral language, it was a written language that was read and understood by tens of thousands of Lakota people. And that's how it spread. It was spread through the mail, through postmasters, through students who were returning from their boarding school semesters or school years, and reading and proliferating this message. It was a message of hope. It was something that was responding to this very, very dire condition, right? It was very much not about withdrawal. It was about active engagement and challenge to that particular reservation order. I'll let you, I
well,
sorry, I interrupted you.
no, 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 no. I was interrupting you, but that was very important to hear. I mean, I see. I think what was fascinating about reading about this was how it shows. It sounds like Mooney. He strikes me as one of these kind of liberals, and that's sort of the liberal kind of views. Like, it wasn't really radical. It didn't have this. It imagined peace between indigenous and white settlers. It was a kind of possible way, kind of forward. Like this is the kind of suggestion. As long as they accept everything that we're requiring of them, let them do their meaningless traditions of spirituality and all of that, because it doesn't amount to anything. They're still going to work. They're going to not take up arms. They're going to be, and this is the colonial approach to all of these. It just reminded me so much, in a way, of course, of the discourse that we've already linked it to, which is this, kind of these are spiritual, kind of accommodationist and assimilationist Muslims who don't believe in taking up violence, as opposed to those who are violent and radical and resisting and not accepting their place within, the global world order and so on. So it sees these movements, whether they're cultural, or religious within this frame entirely from how it relates to the colonial order and its priorities. And in some sense, you have to ask the question, it seems to me, that these liberals aren't asking, which is the colonial authorities of the US settler state did ban all of these things, maybe for a reason. Like they had a reason in their policy of attempting to assimilate and or erase, right? With the demographic you were just describing, it was the lowest ebb. So there's genocide going on. It's like the starvation that's happening is, through disease, through you know, kind of uh, preventing a flourishing life, an economy, that was independent from, the colonial state. Uh, Other techniques, they're destroying the population, and they
Mhm.
also, as part of that, they need and must destroy the culture of the people, convert them to Christianity, and eradicate these other potentially dissident. So, if they are so meaningless, why would the government have been, opposed to them? And I think that's the question that comes, that is rises here, is that it does seem to do a few things. One is it maintains indigenous peoples' identity as a collective. Okay, um, it through practicing or resurfacing some kind of set of practices. It rededicates people to something meaningfully, in their identity as people on the land, with a vision. We could criticize and say, oh, but it's, this is a very fantastical sort of vision, but it is a political vision because it is imagining a future, which is what they want to kill in these contexts. Is that, and I see this all the time when I think of like basically the way in which Islamophobia is like the Western world's kind of major ideology in its relationship with, it's like the foreign policy of white supremacy now. It's like it's got a domestic policy, which is eradicate, indigenous in the
Mhm.
United States, and, stop, black movements, etc. But, it doesn't, you cannot have a vision of a political future as a collectivity in this global, hegemonic imagination of the West. And so that's very important that it continued to do that. And then, secondly, is I think, just as I was kind of raising the issue before, of it's an important and interesting question of what conditions and features can turn what seems to be a messianic or millenarian view that puts off liberation, to some future stage in which we wait for this to happen, but we will do ritual, spiritual prayer and practices, and keep ourselves committed and strong to it. And this will maybe allow us to survive to the time of a liberation that is outside of, present forces that we could, imagine as like, um, you know, uh, human or political in this kind of secular, imagination. So it's this deferral to some future time, and cosmic forces, a great flood, or the earth will shake, right? This is one of the
Yeah.
scenarios, is that the earth will itself shake. Um, However, at some point in certain conditions, this turns into a proactive, not quietistic, but politically active, even if it is just to defend the practice,
Mhm.
because the practice is about your survival as a people with a future. And if that is being prevented, that turns into its own cause of anti colonial resistance. So even if you don't kind of analyze it as a resistance movement in the previous frame, it's this kind of like accommodationist. But the point is that the colonial state prevents any of these things actually being apolitical. I mean,
Mhm.
ultimately, it's impossible for it to really remain, it seems to me, apolitical, because the goal is your eradication. It is genocide. And at a certain point, it turns into the motivation and the profound conditions for reviving an anti colonial resistance movement.
Yeah, it's also important to point out at the turn of the century, and you have in the 1880s the introduction of what are called the civilization regulations. It's a series of orders that came out of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs that banned, specifically targeted religion, for lack of a better term, meaning that medicine men, as they were called, these spiritual leaders were banned. Women were not allowed to even participate. You had the segregation of churches along, imposed sort of gendered lines, the segregation of children through, boarding schools. You have they went down to even what people ate. There's in my course that I teach on federal Indian policy, we read about the butchering of cattle, um, the correct butchering of cattle. So prior to this, women were actually the primary sort of butchers. They were the ones who prepared the meat. They were also the ones who distributed it. And so in an economy like ours, that's a lot of political authority. You're controlling the flow of food. These commissioners recognize this, and of course, you're replacing the buffalo with the cow on one hand, but now you're teaching you're teaching and enforcing the idea that only men are now the butchers and the distributors of food. That has dramatic, implications for the status of women in Lakota and in indigenous societies in general. You also have the banning of the eating of a certain parts of the animal, such as the innards, which was seen as savage. You have the introduction of an industrial sort of slaughtering and butchering of the animal. So this is like even down to how people ate, what they ate, and how food was distributed. This was the kind of control of everyday people's lives. And we think about today, there's all this unprecedented, the deployment of federal troops to Washington, D.C. And, it's really bad what's happening, but it's not the first time this has happened in our histories. And,
Mm.
they targeted these institutions of spirituality and people who held, it wasn't because they actually thought of them as pagan. It was because they were trying to undo the political authority of these individuals
Yeah.
within this society. It was a direct attack on what they call tribalism. There's a reason why in our current political moment, in our political discourse, we talk about tribalism as a bad thing.
Mm.
It's not to say that it's not to say that like everything was great and wonderful back in the past, but if you look at it in the context of communal society, you had to destroy tribalism. You
Yeah.
had to break the bonds of kinship. You had to introduce a form of alienation that was foundational to settler society. This Ghost Dance responds directly to that. It holds large public gatherings, which were banned. It dances in public, which was banned. Dancing was banned. It has a form of prayer in public that's not Christian, which was also banned. It does something heretical in the sense that it takes the language of Christianity. There's the word, he doesn't use it in this translation, but there's the word wanikia, which
Mm.
kind of like has been talked about as Jesus. It's not really a good translation. Wanikia actually just means like the will to live, essentially.
Mm.
But that becomes the prophet, the Wanikia, the son of God, is going to come back, or is back. White people have killed the son of God. They've turned away from even their own faith, and now only God will listen to his red children. That's the sort of premise of this, meaning that it's actually like biblically correct in some ways to say that the meek shall inherit the earth, in that context. And I think it's fascinating that they're using and they're subverting the language of Christianity and using it again in a form of kind of like imminent critique, right, against itself. Oh, you say you're the charitable people of God, but why have you taken so much from us? We just want to live. Wanikia, we just want to live. That's what they're saying over and over again in a lot of these prayers and a lot of these songs that they're singing. They're also talking about, if he translates some of the songs, but they're also talking about the coming of a nation. The nation is returning. The nation being both the animal and the human nation, the nation of the red people, the Oyate Luta, right? There was a concept of a broader sort of notion of a shared American Indian, sort of like, I guess, racial identity. I don't think that's really correct. It wasn't about race, but a common sort of identity of American Indian, which actually means red people or the red nation, as well as sort of the subgroups of American Indians. So this is very much feared, by the government itself, because if you look at the history of the United States and its wars, if we talk about the Indian Wars, the United States has only declared war 5 times in its history, and that was like the War of 1812, the Spanish American War, World War One, and then various sort of declarations of war during World War Two. But yet, its very first war after it created its constitution was a war against a very powerful native confederacy called the Northwest Confederacy, which wiped out the entire standing army, the entire continental army of the United States. And it had allied itself with Great Britain.
Mhm.
So it was in many ways an anti-imperialist uh, confederation of native nations that were organized not just politically but also spiritually about rejecting white settlers' entry, not just physical entry into the Ohio River Valley, but also their cultural, deterioration of Native society. You have another profit-driven movement, just almost 2 decades later. Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh formed the Shawnee sort of confederacy, the Ohio Indian Nation, in the Ohio River Valley to prevent the further expansion of the West. They side with the British, in the War of 1812, and ultimately are betrayed. So you have these profit-driven movements that transcend this sort of narrowness of a kind of a narrow nationalism or a regional nationalism. Begin to think, hey, we need to ally not just as American Indian nation, we have to ally with the enemies of this empire, the British, the French, right, to counterbalance the forces that be. It's not because they're necessarily thinking the British or the French have a superior civilization. It's just a pure tactical move that they understood that this is a genocidal sort of, project that's being pushed upon them, right? And it does express itself in these sort of spiritual ways. And I think it's ironic that the two uh the first Indian War and the last Indian War are both fought over the fear of a unification of American Indian people. They're not talked about in that way. And to sort of wrap up, my portion of the ghost dance, I want to turn to the 20th century because it reverberates well into the 20th century. And I had you read an account by Leonard Crodog,
Mm.
who was a fourth generation medicine man. His great great grandfather Jerome Crodog was participating in um, the ghost dance movement at the time. He had fled with a group of ghost dancers to the Badlands at the time of the Wounded Knee massacre. But he sort of relates this kind of history that it was about spiritual revival, but it was also about resistance, and that these people were not afraid to use force. Like that's the United States government actually understood that. They like yes, it was not about like an active military engagement against federal forces, but as an act of self-defense, they were willing to use violence. And in fact, after Wounded Knee massacre in 1890, there were still armed conflicts. There's an individual named Plenty Horse who went out and assassinated an officer. He was a boarding school survivor. He just returned back from boarding school. He grew his hair long. He joined the ghost dance movement. He heard what had happened to, the ghost dancers, the mini Konju ghost dancers under the leadership of Bigfoot at Wounded Knee, and the killing of more than 300 of them. And he went out and exacted revenge and shot and killed an officer.
Mm.
And he was brought on, they brought him up on murder charges. But they found that the military tribunal and then eventually the courts found that they couldn't actually charge him with anything because a state of war existed. And if they charged him with anything, then they would have to charge all the soldiers who committed the massacre against the Lakota ghost dancers. So he was actually freed. So it wasn't just a sort of one and done kind of thing. There was still a fear that this was sort of percolating within, Lakota societies. And of course, it really erupts in the post-war moment during the Red Power movement that began in the 1960s, and really culminated in this violent armed confrontation with the United States government in 1973 at the occupation of Wounded Knee. A 71-day occupation, and it takes place at the Wounded Knee massacre site. And you have Leonard Crodog, who is a spiritual leader. He himself, many of these Lakota leaders, whether they were political or spiritual leaders, went underground, so to speak. We created treaty councils and societies, spiritual societies that literally went underground. And in fact, even the way that Lakota spirituality was practiced, it was no longer practiced during the day; it was practiced at night. It was a shift, and it was to respond to this repressive nature of the reservation system, to undermine these leaders. And so, one of the ceremonies that was created was called a Lowumpi, which happened at nighttime. All the lights were turned off, and Lowumpi just means to sing. So when the Indian agent would come and he would hear, these people having a ceremony at their house in the middle of the night, they would come and, they'd come and knock on the door and say, "Hey, what are you guys doing?" They're like, "Oh, we're just singing. It's a Lowumpi." In fact, I interviewed Leonard Peltier, the indigenous political prisoner, and he talks about this, how he was sort of a sentry for one of these clandestine, spiritual ceremonies. The children would sit out and sort of distract the Indian police or the Indian agents at the time to prevent them from disrupting these ceremonies. But it was also a place where people organized. It was where knowledge of the treaties and the traditional societies was kept alive. They were kind of nodes of anti-colonial resistance. And so when they took Wounded Knee in 1973, it was about overturning the reservation order, much in the same way as it was in 1890 during the Ghost Dance. The Ghost Dance was responding to the allotment period at that time. It was rejecting this government-imposed system, the way that it had bought off reservation leadership, or had introduced or imposed reservation leadership. Wounded Knee was very similar in the sense that they saw the Oglala Sioux tribal government as much in the same way as they saw the South Vietnamese government. It was an occupation government. It was one that was working in their view, it was one that was working with the United States government to carry out, these mineral leasing that was happening in the Black Hills, this exploratory drilling for all kinds of natural resources, gold, uranium, in and around the area of the Black Hills. So they took up, and it also required a form of repression of these traditional societies, these spiritual societies. And so at Wounded Knee, you had the unification of the sort of traditional political leaders of the clan system, unifying with the sort of medicine or the spiritual leaders, and saying, this is the place where we'll take our stand. And it wasn't just symbolic. I mean, it was an armed conflict with the United States government. The federal, it wasn't just about federal policing, it was also about the use of military force against them. This hasn't fully been talked about, but because in the United States we have this thing called the Posse Comitatus Act, which prevents the deployment of the military against for like policing situations against U.S. citizens or civilians. In this context, the military, much like they were operating in South Vietnam, actually came in plain clothes. The generals came in plain clothes to not as to look like civilians, right? While also directing the logistics of the deployment, as he lists in this recounting of Wounded Knee, the deployment of M16 machine guns, armored personnel carriers, all the kind of accoutrements of modern military operations, right, against people who were literally mostly armed with 22s and rifles that they couldn't even find ammunition for. So this was in the context of that armed confrontation, which did result in people getting hurt, some of them losing their lives. You also have this sort of rebirth of a kind of spirituality, a spiritual tradition, grounding them back with the ghost dance was practiced during this occupation, the 71-day occupation. You have people who are seeing their sort of resistance against the United States government in the context of the rebirth of their own spiritual traditions, right? And it wasn't just an individual, as much it was an individual thing, but it was a collective thing. And it was freedom was achieved in the context of repression, of a very kind of repressive situation, right? Where one could actually lose their life. Um, this resonated, beyond the sort of confines of just of Pine Ridge or of Wounded Knee. It was something that was seen throughout the world as, oh wow, the people who we thought had died off, the religions, the spiritual traditions of people that we thought had died off, are still fighting. And they have an armed resistance movement. They declared independence from the United States government. They've created the society that they want to live in. They created hospitals. They created an engineering, thing to build houses. They had a housing authority. Even had a sort of Department of State that gave people citizenship cards. Even non-natives got citizenship cards to the independent Oglala Nation, right? But this was all grounded in a sort of the notion of treaties. But those treaties were codified through and consecrated through our religious practices, our ceremonies of Wolokota, which means peacemaking, right? Um, no peace without justice, right? As Jared Ball likes to say, and that's really what they believed with these treaties. If they're not going to enforce them, and under the letter of peace, then they shall be enforced under the letter of armed resistance, because they were supposed to end the conflict, the military conflict between two people. And because one side has not lived up to those agreements, then things should be reverted back to the way they were prior to that, right? That was their argument at the time. And so the ghost dance isn't necessarily kind of widely practiced the way that it was, nearly a century before the Wounded Knee occupation in 1973, but was nonetheless foundational. I think many ways was a continuation of that sort of vision of and that prophecy of a people. It was essentially what I think, if you were to distill the ghost dance down to its bare components, it was about dignity.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something that, we can talk about material conditions, we can talk about food, we can talk about all these things, but I think the universal aspect here that you'll find in all of these resistance movements is the question of dignity, how people live a dignified life. And I think, this translates into modern sort of formations of the water protector movement, Standing Rock, that is still ongoing, very much folded into the anti-genocide, Palestine liberation movement that's happening here. Native people have been actively involved. It's very much in the consciousness of us to look beyond just the sort of confines of our own world and to see this as something that's unfolding globally that we're participating in. I'll just stop there, and I'll turn it over to you, Anand, because I know we're like halfway through this kind of conversation, but I know you have a lot to say. So,
Oh no, well, I found that account by Leonard Crowdog really just so incredibly interesting and moving. So I'm so glad that you introduced me to that, because I've read here and there some things about the Wounded Knee, but that perspective and the focus and interest that he had really gave a very different kind of picture. And I kept thinking throughout it how many resonances there were to the kind of siege in Gaza, not necessarily in scale, and of course, uh, without a full scale massacre, which is what was expected, and in several accounts, well, in both accounts that you gave me, was attributed to the presence of international media, really. Um, but there were so many features that were, you could see how the colonial logic operates, and also how resistance operates. And A couple of the things that I thought was very interesting about that, was one, the kind of goon squad, and we just see that happening as well. This colonial approach to trying to set up and empower uh, co-opted new leaderships that aren't necessarily part of the traditional, because these other ones can be more easily co-opted and then made official through the institutions of the colonial state, and how they operate essentially like gangs. And this is exactly what you see. The PA
Mhm.
is looks a lot like one of these kind of band chiefs recognized, it seems like, by the BIA or something like that, the colonial state. But
But
also,
you also see this in like Afghanistan and
yeah,
Syria, this like warlordism.
yes,
It's like you just kind of pick these cartels or these warlords or these factions or these sectarian groups, and you fund them to create or to destabilize, resistance movements, or to destabilize the state or people who the United States opposes at that time. The Indian Wars are very much alive, in that part of the globe.
absolutely. I mean, you think you've made that point in many of your discussions about the connections between the U.S. wars, in the global war on terror and against the indigenous wars. Um, so that was one thing. Of course, reminds me of this Yasser Abu Shabab and like the criminal sort of gangs that uh, oppose and undermine resistance, to the colonial regime. But on that kind of more religious or spiritual kind of component, I was very much struck in both of the accounts, first person accounts, autobiographical accounts, um, how there was a very conscious sense of willingness to sacrifice. We are facing death here. It's come to the point where we have nothing left to lose, and we are making a conscious collective pact that we are willing to stand up, even if it means our death. And I think that's not an easy thing to do. And it doesn't happen so easily without some kind of um, way of dealing with your connection to a larger history, a larger whole. And that's one thing that I was really intrigued and interested by the Go stance, especially at Wounded Knee, as a way of reconnecting with the martyrs of the past and somehow channeling that as a source of strength to commit yourself to the ultimate. And that just reminds me so much of what's happening in Gaza. You know. Um, anyway, that was something that was very impressive about that. That's a component that connects in some ways the relationship between indigenous forms of religious or spiritual commitment with anti-colonial resistance movements, that they take and enable making that kind of a commitment, which isn't easy to do. So it's something that's a thread that connects many of them, it seems to me. And it just reminds us of how much this sacrifice is needed and how difficult that is. And it's the price that is paid to achieve liberation. And this is one important thing about reminding about these histories, because everything else in the culture that we live in, and of course our natural instincts for self-preservation, militates against thinking that maybe there are some things um, that are worth sacrificing for. So that um, was one important point. I want to mention something beforehand that I forgot to mention before, which was about that there's so many traditions of the way in which some kind of religious or spiritual experience was important in rebellions, and whether they were against colonialism or slavery. And basically, they're just, slavery and rebellions against slavery were really anti-colonial, rebellions, because they're rebellions against the settler colonial racial state that has used enslavement as, a kind of mechanism. Um, if you think of the Haitian Revolution, it started with the, Bois Caiman ceremony, where people committed themselves, just as I was, meditating upon what happened at Wounded Knee, um, to fighting to the death, to risk it all to free themselves. If you think of the Bahia slave revolts that actually were in Brazil in the 1830s, really massive, kind of the largest scale since after the Haitian Revolution of slave rebellions. They were really organized by West African Muslim scholars who used uh, writing in Arabic to circulate messages and organize a kind of coordinated, uprising that wouldn't have been possible without being able to pass messages in this way. Um, and again, so there was like a kind of religious dimension or component to anti-slavery and anti-colonial resistance movements. But in this account by Leonard, um, Crow Dog, I just was also quite amazed at what we saw in terms of the internal organization, quite apart from the kind of religious component and spiritual traditions. And he is a, medicinal healer, and he deployed his knowledge as part of the, effective way of healing people wounded in the attacks by federal agents and law enforcement during the siege, but also just how organized, and manufacturing their own weapons. Okay, I really thought this, just there were so many resonances to me of the inventiveness and the organizational capacities of indigenous peoples fighting settler colonialism, between this case of the siege, um, at Wounded Knee, and what's happening in Gaza. These infrastructure, reorganizing society to, maintain resistance. It just said to me in some profound way, uh, all of these histories of anti-colonial movements are connected. And I think we ignore an important component and factor of them if we don't pay attention to the indigenous traditions, whether we think of them as just cultural kind of features that are important to their life ways, or if we think about them as religion or spirituality. That they're, I don't know if we want to think of it as psychological, spiritual. I'm not sure what the best language is, but in just the same way that there are clearly some kind of spiritual ills of Western consumer society that lead people to seek after some of these appropriated, um, and uh, uh, appropriated and extracted forms of spiritual orientation from those that they have, tried to eradicate. Uh, or if you think of it as religion, in a more kind of confessional sort of way, they are an important part of the story, because so much of what is required is the sense of collectivity, of connection with one another, and of commitment. And those are reinforced, it seems to me, through these kinds of resources. And if you just abandon these resources, and we see what was the condition of those who, um, assimilated and lose their culture or convert to the colonizer's religion, if that's even an option for them. Sometimes it's not. You don't find necessarily that they are then equipped with the same kinds of resources for anti colonial resistance that they are if they can draw upon and maintain. These other, and even if they're somewhat invented, that was another fascinating component of it. People think of religion and tradition as some kind of static thing. It's dynamic to the historical circumstances, especially in these moments of revolutionary resistance and change, is that the religious, spiritual, the traditional becomes updated, or you even invent new ones that are authentic to the moment and to the purpose. And, they don't have to be from time immemorial. They have to suit the needs, the values, of the people in struggle and resistance, at the time. And I think about that in the context, for example, of I think, a very analogous kind of religious movement to what we were seeing with the prophecies of the ghost dance and so on, which is the Nation of Islam,
Hmm.
for example. This is not like what people would, if you look at the theology of it, related in some ways to kind of Orthodox Islam, but likewise, it was actually, was not trying to contest uh, power in the civic institutions or take up arms necessarily in a kind of direct battle against federal authorities and the state and the police and so on. It was also a a prophecy that analyzed fully white supremacy and society within a kind of theological uh, characterization of the white man as the devil, and with a whole kind of mythology, you could say, around it that rested and relied upon, some point in the future, this would all be erased and replaced. And yet it was so feared and targeted, even though it was the same message: work hard, be self-sufficient, don't cause trouble, be law abiding, but keep your Black identity separate, build your own institutions, don't try and go into the white man's world, and eventually it is going to be destroyed and replaced, and you will have your freedom. It's the architecture of is very similar to the prophecies of the ghost dance as a prophet of rebellion. And yet, of course, what came out of the Nation of Islam was Black Power movements, was the Black Panthers, people who decided, hey, we're going to, take a more proactive stance of political contestation and anti-colonial movements. And there was, in some ways, a kind of pipeline between the Nation of Islam and some of these other movements that actually confronted U.S. state power, that had an analysis of it as colonialism. And so it reminded me so much of the way in which we tend to think that these religious movements are quietist, um, and often sometimes try and recover them by saying, well, they really weren't planning on any kind of political activity, and they enjoined upon their members kind of thrift and sobriety and working hard and all these kinds of values that could be seen as assimilation, except they are absolutely radically against assimilation. And
Hmm.
that's in fact actually what made them so dangerous, is because they preserved some sense of resistant identity, even if they didn't activate into struggle, because they projected a future scenario where other forces would somehow solve the problem. But what they still do is nurture a kind of independent spirit of resistance and avoiding assimilation into white society, into the settler colonial society, that then is a resource later for it becoming activated in one way or another. I mean, many people read Malcolm X's book. They didn't necessarily, some of them became members of the Nation of
Hmm.
Islam. Others just became radicalized, by his absolute defiance. So I think these things can not, they aren't necessarily simple in the way in which they operate, and we have to go into a deeper analysis to see what resources they actually cultivate and allow for anti-colonial resistance movements.
Mm. Yeah, that's a. I was just thinking a lot about how, in this moment when you were talking, I've been returning more so, and I don't know what your personal experience is, more so like to our own traditions and trying to understand these histories, especially in this moment. Like the war that we fought was like well over 80 years, long. It was decades long. It wasn't just a wounded knee, kind of one and done kind of thing. It was multiple engagements, uh, all kinds of different plot twists. And I was reading I've talked about this and wrote about this on my Substack. I was reading the biography of Crazy Horse recently, and there's this moment where Crazy Horse, our famed sort of Tashunka Witko, he's our famed sort of military spiritual kind of leader. He had this vision where he, as a young man, where he was untouched by bullets, by the enemy's bullets and arrows,
Hmm.
but he was ultimately, taken off of his horse by his own people. He was subsequently killed by his own people. So too was Sitting Bull. So it shows you kind of the nature of the repression, right? You're talking about in Gaza, and you have this kind of traitorous regime of the Palestinian Authority preventing, not preventing, but really actively suppressing resistance movements, and not actively going after Zionists and the colonizers, but only policing their own, essentially, right? And you see this in the reservation period. You have the creation of Indian Scouts. They were the ones who killed Crazy Horse. They were the ones who killed um, Sitting Bull. But there's this moment in Crazy Horse's biography where he is standing amongst his own people, like who is the charred remains of his own people who had just been massacred by the military. And he has this moment where he realizes what he's confronting is not anything his people have ever confronted in history. This is a genocidal force. He like has this moment where he's like, you can't fight this enemy the way that we have fought our enemies in the past, where there was some, modicum of honor on the battlefield, that certain things weren't done right to your enemies. Not to say that like that those things didn't happen, they did, but not to the scale that they were happening, not to the degree, not to the intent that they were happening. And he's like, he realizes that you can't fight them this way. You have to fight. They're waging a war of annihilation. We have to wage a war of annihilation, not because we have to degrade ourselves, because this is a war of survival now, right? This is a war of attrition. It's not going to be won in a single battle, like one decisive victory. It's one that has to be fought over on different scales. And I was thinking a lot about, his sort of heroism um, was very much a result of his vision, in the sense that he did feats that were considered, superhuman and supernatural. And I see these videos that are, I watch the Electronic Intifada, and I watch the Resistance Report by John Elmer, which I'm sure a lot of you do. And you see they replay these guerrilla actions by the Palestinian resistance in Gaza, and they're not just, it's not just like wanton destruction. It's not just like, oh, we're just like going to show you the scenes of violence. They show you, they always say a prayer. They say, that it's very much grounded in a very like spiritual practice, right? And it's fascinating because in the West, there's the Western brain, the reptilian Orientalist brain, hears that prayer and immediately thinks of it as terrorism. Oh, they're praying, this is a terroristic act, because they automatically associate Islam with terrorism. And I wanted to ask you, like, maybe to like meditate a little bit on that, and like how there's this larger question of indigeneity in Islam, and this anti-colonial resistance that's happening now. How do we make sense of this in this moment? Because I think again, hate to do these like extremes, but it's helpful to sort of talk about it, because on one hand you have a on one hand you have this utter demonization of these movements. They're criminal, right? How dare you do this? Like it's showing you that they're just like fundamentalists. It's irrational, right? It's an irrational behavior. It's just guided by pure irrationality and violence, right? The lust for violence, right? This is what's being promoted by the State Department, and why the United States and these Western powers are backing the genocide, right? These are not people, right? These are not normal people. They're just violent heathens, much like Native people are violent heathens. On the other hand, there's also maybe not so much in the Islamic world, but maybe in the non-Islamic world, there's kind of a fetishization of this a little bit, and I like, in the sense that they don't. You see a lot of people becoming interested, and I think that's important. I think they're beginning to question these things. But I just wanted to hear your perspectives on this. How do we make sense of the resistance and spirituality in this context, but also these kind of two, I don't want to say extremes, but different kind of poles of how people are perceiving it? Because I do think on one hand, somebody just observing, it's like I think of our, the American Indian movement used to say, in the spirit of crazy horse, right? In the
Hmm.
spirit of total resistance. And I see that same spirit being enacted in this way. It's like people are like, how do we, these are like superhuman feats. They're facing a famine, they're facing a blockade. How are they getting, they're engineering their own, guerrilla action devices. And it's like, well, what do you think the Viet Cong did? What do you think all these guerrilla forces through history did? They had to. It was a matter, it was a matter of choice. How they did it was unique to their own circumstances. But anyways, I wanted to hear your sort of thoughts on that, because I think I have a lot of questions about it. I don't have, solid answers. I'm not an expert in this field, but I can see sort of parallels to our experience.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously a pretty complex issue or question. And, both extremes probably, well, certainly the one, oh, it's just terrorism because, if it's done, and I think the left has some kind of problem with it too, I would say, is that they don't really want to think, if they're pro, resistance, they don't really want to think that, part of the motivation, part of the resources, part of
Mm.
the mentality depends upon, analysis. Well, it depends on some kind of resource that's not based in, kind of material analysis, and can't, really be seen as rational in the same way. Except that I would say, if you're fighting for your survival, what helps you sustain your survival through a genocide is pretty rational, that you will use anything that you can to maintain your focus, your determination, your sumud, your absolute commitment to persevering on the land, on your absolute determination to resist, your resilience. Like, all of these things are resources you cannot dismiss. I mean, it's not, these are human beings. So I would say human beings have to have some kind of resource of discipline, of motivation, of psychological ways of dealing with the setbacks, the incredible disparity in the, capabilities of weight of, military violence being used against them, to continue to resist and to still think that this is a reasonable thing to do, rather than flee, and, give up, surrender, and allow yourself to be colonized and ultimately, genocided. So, to my mind, is it's not really possible to understand, it seems to me, without also going into some level of the cultural analysis, psychological analysis. And in this case, this is a culture that is steeped in particular religious tradition. And what I would say is that religious tradition, even though, many people have forgotten components of it, it has within it, in just the same way that the ghost dance might have been possible to revive, it has a new kind of meaning, maybe in the new conditions in the 1960s and 70s, when people are, trying to deal with the problems facing indigenous communities in against the colonial state in that era, versus in the 1880s and 90s, when, it first seemed to be emerging. Um, Likewise, what we see is that there is a lot of these kinds of stories. You find that there are a lot of stories that, maybe they exaggerate the superhuman. Like, these are things that rationally we wouldn't uh, credit, but, it's clear that people are sacrificing to a level and using absolutely every resource, every capability to fight, to resist. And maybe we should just be astonished why we are so incapable in our circumstances of, uh, wielding anything like this kind of determination for change in our context. But they're facing, the ultimate case of you know uh, staving off a genocide. So, um, yeah, I guess what I would say is that there is this kind of long history of, what one scholar has called uh, Sufi warriorism. this long history of anti-colonial, and it wasn't always anti-colonial. I mean, it could be also deployed, against others, other Muslims, other, kind of contiguous societies as part of like expanding political and social and cultural geographies and so on. But when it came to protecting against colonial domination and control, it was available as a resource historically, socially, religiously. And there's just so much history here related to the kinds of solidarity that were created in these intense, what you were calling like the formation of these spiritual societies, is like what you would think these Sufi brotherhoods or Turuk Sufi orders were like, is that they really engage the kind of sentiments of your interiority, your kind of emotional and psychological life dedicated to kind of self improvement and collective adherence to certain principles, and a bond of community and brotherhood with a sense of leadership, that sometimes could, even be very authoritarian, that you listen to your spiritual sheikh, these leaders like Hajj Omar Tal, Uthman Danfodio, who waged jihad against the British, Hajj Omar Tal against the French, Sufi Abdul Qadir in Algeria for more than a decade, about against the French. They could draw upon this kind of charismatic tradition of valorizing the leader who is helping you achieve your spiritual and social and collective goals. That's a resource that I think is available in some ways to the people of Gaza. And I don't think you can understand their resistance if you don't credit that there is some spiritual foundation and fortitude that is maintaining their absolute commitment and their fearlessness and willingness to sacrifice. I've seen, and that's not just the people who are fighting. That's everybody.
Mhm.
Everybody is recruited into this um, commitment to persist, and showing incredible resilience, and that in itself is resistance, in this time. I've seen so many videos, of people saying, like, I just lost my brother, or, and, they'll say, Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakil, you know, power is to God. We trust in God. This incredible patience. Of course, they're torn apart by grief, but they find something in this that allows them to continue and to live and to be resistant. And I think that's something that has to be understood and has to be honored. It can't be easily manufactured. And at least that's the language that they are using, um, to as a resource for them in their struggle against a genocide. And I don't want people to over valorize it, that they're doing superhuman things, but human beings need that kind of motivation and psychological discipline, and we're witnessing an incredible testimony to what human beings are capable of, um, if they band together in a vision of collective defense of their society, their culture on the land, as an indigenous population against a settler colonial state. It's really quite extraordinary.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that's a really great way to put it. And I think my sort of comments are not to say that these are superhuman, but these are actually very human responses. And
Yeah.
I think what I think about a lot of our training in the activist scene. There's a lot of these trainings on nonviolent resistance or nonviolent civil disobedience, as they call it. And sure, like, I think most people don't wake up and like say, hey, I'm going to engage in violent resistance today. Some people do, because it's a necessity, right? And we shouldn't discount that. But I think that there's been this sort of indoctrination to that this becomes a sort of pathology that's necessary for every situation. And I think about this conversation I had with one of my friends, Mark Tilson. He's a poet. He's a Lakota a water protector too. He said, these we do these trainings about like locking down to pipeline equipment and everything. He's like, and then we experience the most unnatural thing, which is we see our relatives, we see our friends brutalized by the state around us, and we've trained ourselves not to react.
Mhm.
We've trained ourselves to be passive in some ways, and to go limp. And he's like, this is not a natural reaction. He's like, there's something very unnatural about that. As somebody who, advocated for those kind of tactics, given the circumstances that he was in, he's like, he recognizes that this is insane. This is not actually what we do. When you see somebody get attacked, right? Your natural response is to defend, to preserve your own life. And I think about that in the context of what's happening, and I think maybe it seems superhuman to a society that has been very much pacified in certain
Yes.
ways to accept certain levels of violence. And I think, and everyone is always saying, oh, we need to turn to the third world. And it's like, y'all are really, really colonized. And like going back to the start of this conversation, it's like the levels of alienation is our struggle. Like, there are so many levels of alienation, so many levels of naturalizing things that are just not natural. It's not natural to not have a home. It's not natural to not have access to clean drinking water, to healthcare, to just care in general. Those are things that maybe other countries in the world don't have materially kind of built up, but socially they've integrated. They still have them integrated into their systems, right? And so we see, I think, in the context of Gaza, which is really fascinating. I don't know who pointed this out. I was listening to a podcast. Maybe it was John Elmer who pointed this out. I want to cite people and give them credit for their observations. And he said, you don't see the levels of defection, even despite the famine, even despite the just utter brutality and depravity of just an onslaught of genocidal behavior, just killing children. We don't see the defection to that side. He's like, that's a testament to Samud. That's a testament to something that we should aspire to. In many ways, it's the moral, perhaps spiritual compass of our movements right now. And it's also in many ways a warning they're using Gaza as an example.
Mm-hmm.
This is what's going to happen to you if you resist. This
Yeah.
is a warning. This is, terrorism isn't just about the population that's being, targeted. It's also about a warning to the rest of the world. We're going to terrorize it. Yeah. People wonder why there isn't, a bigger response to a live stream genocide. And my first response is, we live in a settler colonial society that has just naturalized all these genocides or forgotten about it, in such a way. It's like not just genocide against indigenous people, but also the genocide against African people by stealing them. And they don't even think of that as genocide.
Yeah.
According to the definition of even the normative definition of genocide, that is a taking away children from their family. That's a form of genocide at the very least, but I think, like in the context of the current moment, it is fascinating that we see, like, even for myself, this kind of turn back to like looking at like, how is it that we did survive? And actually these spiritual traditions are the basis for our resistance, and you actually can't ignore that.
Mm-hmm.
I think in some instances they get sort of fetishized and depoliticized in a way where it's like all of a sudden we're just reading land acknowledgements and we're not stopping anything, or we're just putting a feather in, the cap of a state that is bent on our destruction. It's an interesting moment to live in where we, the life expectancy of my people in South Dakota, the state where I'm from, is 59 years old. That's the median life expectancy right now. But there are no sort of like emergencies. I'm not trying to like dog on anybody, but that's the moment of reaction we're in right now. This is the moment of repression we're in right now, where you can have a live stream genocide. You have the federal occupation of cities. And then also you have this the sort of the social forces, the comorbidities of colonialism that are literally killing off people of my generation, people of my age. And what is the response to this? I mean, I think we've seen the ways that these political parties have literally sucked the soul out of these movements and co-opted them, depoliticized them, the way that they try to do that to our our spiritual traditions. And I think we're just in this moment where I don't think we things are going to get better. And this is me saying this as somebody who's not trying to be a pessimist, but I don't think they're going to get better. I think we're in a years long, perhaps decades long transformation that perhaps we can't see, much as the ghost dancers, much as the people struggling in Palestine right now can't see the future. We can't predict the future. We can't see what's coming down the pipeline. We're living in the moment, right? But I think that what these spiritual traditions allow us to do is really to decenter ourselves, and to think in sort of temporal and spatial terms, that the sort of urgency of the moment, the attention economy, the dopamine casinos of our smartphones don't really allow us to do. And I think if there's a testament to the resilience of Palestinians, it is that, it's like we really have to step outside of ourselves to even critically think about our own positions, in societies that are benefiting from this genocide, but also and how to undermine it in the best ways possible, because we really truly hold in many ways much more responsibility than any other people in the world. And it's how we accept that responsibility that I think is really important. And I think some of these conversations we're having about spiritual tradition, anti-colonial resistance is incredibly important, because I think there's, one of the things that I always fascinating. I went with a group of, I won't name names. I went with a group of like Western leftists one time to Brazil, and we went to do MST camps. Met all kind of different, social movements, and they came and they sang and they danced, and some of them were prayers. They were like very spiritual, traditions, and each movement had their own. Each movement had their song. Each movement had their dance, and we didn't have a dance. I mean, I sang a song. I was that guy, I was like, I was singing a song, but it was fascinating, because even in our political organizing in the West, it's very much valorized to have this sort of secularism, as if this is the way, this is the universal sort of way, and it's just not practiced elsewhere. It didn't say, when I went to these meetings or these encounters with different Brazilian social movements, it didn't say that one was better than the other. It was like, we are all equal, in the way that we believe and come to this movement, right? And we just don't have that. I mean, it's very, I don't know if you've ever been, like our faculty meetings can be this way, but like sometimes organizing spaces can be this way. Yeah. And I think I think that is the effect of colonialism. Whether it's not just about Native people, it's always about Native people, but it's not just about us too. It's also about the ways that different diasporic groups come to these countries and get assimilated into them, right? And they become whitewashed in their own ways, or assimilated into sort of the state apparatus, and become sort of functionaries, right? It's not just, and I'm not picking on like immigrant populations. I think this is what like whiteness and white supremacy, that's the function of it, first and foremost is an assimilate. They're like the Borg from Star Trek, right? That they are the assimilatory sort of identity, because they took what were distinct European identities and put them into one, right? And even though we live in multicultural, multiracial societies, it doesn't mean that people don't adhere to those sort of principles of white supremacy, or practice them, or internalize them. It's very much the case. And we see this playing out. Even, I just think about, I'm sorry to go off topic here, but I just think about just the utter anti-China sentiment, or the utter anti-Russia sentiment, the utter anti-Islamic sentiment that we encounter in our daily lives. Is so fascinating, because it assumes a superior mode of living, a superior, civilization. And I'm just looking around like, our trains don't run on time. Our airplanes are falling out of the sky. We have unchecked, like, climate change. Like there's no regulations, like at all. We don't have healthcare. Our teeth are falling out of our our heads. Like, people are living in their cars, like even faculty members, our colleagues are living in their cars, and we're supposed to uphold this as like, thus, the apotheosis of civilization, and all these other people are like backwards. It's a very dangerous ideology that we've internalized. And I think more and more I've as I come to these things, and I think I've learned this through studying our own spiritual traditions and the way that they have been studied by the colonizer, the way that they have gathered intelligence on our movements, and have attempted to distort those traditions, that the fight for education is incredibly important in a very illiterate, politically illiterate, spiritually illiterate society. And I think that becomes sort of my mom was a teacher, and I think that becomes sort of my mission and modus operandi in doing these podcasts and reading, these texts, and trying to really understand like the depths to which it's not just about an innocent sort of like indoctrination in the classroom. There's a lot of blood, there's a lot of suffering that goes into these kinds of beliefs, right? And I think the first and foremost person to suffer by believing them is the people who do believe them, right? They dehumanize themselves. They degrade themselves first and foremost. It's not Palestinians who are
Mm.
dehumanized. It's their colonizers who have dehumanized themselves to the point that they think that this is necessary for their existence. That's where the pity is. And I go back to Crazy Horse, because he pitied
Hmm.
the white soldier, who he was like, who makes a career out of killing?
Yeah.
This is anathema to us. This is not normal. I pity the people who have alienated themselves to the point where they can do these things to us, right? If they can do them to us, they can do them to anybody. And I think that's the position that these spiritual traditions have taught me. It's not,
Hmm.
we are not being dehumanized. It's actually the person who is trying to suppress our cultures and our religions and our spirituality who's dehumanizing themselves.
That's right. I mean, and I think that's something that anyone seeing the resilience and sumud and determination, and the care that Palestinians have afforded one another, they're doing everything to try and tear that apart by making a scramble for survival and change the aid regime so that people will fight with one another and descend into what it was their vision that Palestinians are, but in fact, actually, they've been the opposite through almost 2 years of, genocide. That, despite what they're facing, to maintain their dignity, and the attempts to humiliate and to strip them of their dignity have only redounded upon exposing the barbarity, the disgusting, characteristics, the anxiety, the fragility of the colonial, settler subject and their culture, in their attempt to dehumanize and strip the dignity of the Palestinians. They've just exposed themselves. And we were just talking on Tanky Group Therapy recently about Ben Gavir's. I brought up Ben Gavir's visit to the cell of Marwan Barghouti, political prisoner and acknowledged by many. And even, this the other thing is that the reason why he went to that cell is because he knows this would be basically the kind of Mandela or
Mm.
figure around which the whole Palestinian national struggle could cohere. If he were able to lead his people, he would be their, acknowledged leader, and that includes, like Hamas has many times said, release Marwan Barghouti and the other political prisoners, and there will be a national unity government, and we don't have to be really a part of it,
Mhm.
in the direct kind of political way. And so, of course, he's got that symbolic character, and they're doing so poorly in being able to destroy the Palestinians except through massive violence against civilians and destruction of their infrastructure. But in terms of the actual, warrior sort of spirit, they're not, capable really, as we keep seeing, of uh, suppressing, the resistance. Um, that this is compensatory, compensatory, and it reveals absolutely everything about, how bankrupt it is. And so I think that problem and that question of the dignity, and maintaining their dignity through all of this, is very important. And those kind of spiritual and cultural and commitments to your way, your society, your culture are so important as part of resistance. And it did also remind me in your point about the demonstration effect of this, is that if they can do this to the Palestinians, this is the thing, is that we're seeing the degrading of the human. The unwillingness to stop this is actually doing irrevocable damage to whatever concept of universal human dignity there was. I mean, we're just going to have a kind of racialized, I mean, very obvious, it already was, but now it's just going to be very obvious and open that, some lives count and others don't, and that they can't even maintain the fiction of these principles of universality, human rights, and so on. Um, but that, Gustavo Petro said clearly in his speech at the Hague, meeting in Bogota, Colombia, a couple of months ago, that, this is what the super rich have in store for the rest of us. In Gaza,
Mhm.
you're seeing how they will treat the rest of us. And, that message and that understanding has to become clearly more widely felt, for uh, a stop, of this to take place, is that we have to really feel the collective risk and danger we are putting Gazans through as a sacrifice for the super rich's vision of the world and the future. Or, is there going to be a future for humanity that is dignified, that respects the human? And so I really feel like, that that's what's at stake. That's what's at stake here. In this, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, it's a very like I think like just going back to our conversations and each of these moments, like our present and the past, these resistance movements arose in times of terrible danger, right? It wasn't just like, times are great, let's start a new spiritual movement. It was times are really bad, and this is as much as it is a reaction to it, it's also trying to create the alternative to it. And I think that's important to remember. You have to have these sort of dialectics in place that, again, and I really appreciate your comments on this and the readings that you shared, that these traditions change. And that's the indication of a healthy spiritual
Hmm.
tradition. That's an indication of a healthy religion. I think when they can't change, and I think if
Yeah.
you think about the Zionist project, it's like it's all in on genocide, from top to bottom. It's there. I don't know. I think people are more interested in trying to find sort of cracks or elements that can be recuperated, and more just saying we don't. This is it. This is all. This is our existential war. It's not the existential war for Palestinian livelihood. It's actually the existential war for that entity, whether it has a future. And I think
Hmm.
that's the important, and we there's a phrase that we say all the time in our in our own spaces. It's called spiritual warfare. It is spiritual warfare. At stake is more than just the material sort of victory. I mean, that's
Yeah.
incredibly important, but at the end of the day, it's like there is a sort of I don't want to say metaphysical, but there's sort of this intangible element you can't quite put your finger on, and I fully understood it the first time. I'm thinking of Bolivia because today their presidential elections are underway, and there people do denigrate these movements, these indigenous movements, for their outwardly cultural, spiritual connotations, right? Oh well, like and here in North America and Canada and the United States, we are critical of these forms of settler state recognition, right?
Hmm.
But that's not what's happening here. In these contexts, these are grounded with real material gains. There's pride and dignity, right? In seeing these things. And I think we've become so pessimistic sometimes within um, the realm. I think pessimism is sometimes a privilege when you're in the imperial core, um, because it's like pessimism is the idea that nothing is going to change. that's the modus operandi of there is no alternative, right?
Right.
um, and what our sort of tradition shows is that things do change. Our cultures change. Our resistance movements change. We're a long-standing resistance movement. We have this really beautiful history that precedes even the founding of these nations, and will exceed their demise as well. And so I think that's something that I think about, and in the context of this sort of this idea of spiritual warfare. It's also temporal, right? What does it mean to pre-exist but also exist in spite of something for such a long period of time? Does it mean that you've acquiesced? I don't think so. I think there's something a little bit deeper at play. It also suggests that because this, there's the kind of recurrence of this, this idea that settler colonialism is a thing of the past is completely blown out of the water. This is a 21st century phenomenon, right? This isn't some 19th century barbarity, as people are saying. This is like, it's just, instead of the cavalry, you have drones. Instead of the cavalry, you have AI technology, right? The social relations are the same. The technology is different. And I think there's also, I want to get your final thoughts on this, but I also think spirituality is also a technology of resistance in many
Mm-hmm.
ways.
Mm-hmm.
And it's how we utilize that, and to understand the power of a human being to do incredible, things. How is it that everyday people, and their daily acts of resistance, whether it's, through teaching school amidst a genocide, through, taking care of children amidst a genocide, really transforms into a political movement that sort of changes the course of history.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. What I've been trying to say, I keep talking about resources, but I could say, technology of resistance. And I think in a way, even left movements have some of the same character of these religious structures we were just talking about in some ways. Think of Marx, like it's inevitable. The forces of history will create a condition where, capitalism will, collapse, and the, proletariat will emerge as a kind of function of a historical logic. It's almost a messianic, vision. It's almost a millenarian kind of sense of salvation history. It's just a secularized one. And then there are others who thought, no, you have to make it happen, and you have to be active in trying to create these conditions, and so on. And it's very similar to what we were saying about how this kind of vision in the prophecy of the ghost dance, or in some of these other kinds of movements, that there is a deferral of an end to this situation of oppression, that it is inevitable how it's going to happen. Of course, for Marx, it was a kind of theory of history, based in these kind of material conditions. There, sort of, we're also seeing at least the structure of the logic. Um, something like a deferred, but it's going to happen. In this prophecy within a redemptive history that allows us to continue to you know to to resist and preserve ourselves in this condition. And I think, in fact, actually, if you just said, like, the Western leftists that went with you on this trip to Brazil, like, you didn't have a song, you didn't have a culture, an active culture of resistance. At one point in history, people would have. Their Communist International, the labor unions would have various songs, and they had a culture, a working class culture, that was expressed through an organized body that could make demands and work on its behalf. But it also sustained, and it created a culture of resistance to class oppression. And we've gotten away from really thinking, which is so strange in this era where, like, there's been such a culturalist turn. You would think, that all these lefty kind of postmodern intellectuals, but because postmodernism was just this kind of individualistic adaptation to neoliberal, capitalism and consumer society, rather than anything really resistant. It didn't develop or invent kind of cultural components for creating collectivities and sustaining a culture of resistance. So we're not equipped with those tools. And I think on we have to find those ways. Like, if you don't want to be part of like some religious community because you don't believe in those things, we can understand that, but you have to have some disciplined kind of psychological resources of, building your character that leads you to connect yourself with something outside yourself. And you need to have collective culture that you can share to make those bonds of solidarity actually meaningful. It's like we've forgotten anything about social science, on the left. And it just reminds me that, this figure that I'm starting to work on a little bit and I have a project on him in an upcoming conference to try and use this pre-modern Muslim historian and scholar who is sometimes credited with kind of inventing the social sciences because he wanted a theory for history and believed that, like other philosophical or scientific disciplines, it followed rules and norms that could be understood. And so he tried to think, what would those be? And he created a kind of system of thinking about how, say, for example, tribal solidarities were the engine of a certain kind of history and state formation in North Africa, as his main sort of example, and that the most powerful kind of force was the social force of people feeling some kind of solidarity, some kind of collective sense of connection that was based in their sentiments but could be socialized as a kind of social force. That is what bound people. It wasn't just families and tribes. There were other kinds of networks like patron client also that could be. And so he was really trying to theorize how you take these internal, emotional, or what we would call psychological sentiments of affinity, and actually they become the basis of social power. And in fact, I think that's a great theory for all of those Sufi warriorism that I was, kind of talking about, is that there was a way of kind of socializing some sense of these other emotional and spiritual collective commitments. And I, really think that we need to be thinking about like what kind of a culture we can build that sustains solidarity in a much more robust way than we've been doing, I think. And this is the place where, at least for some people, some of these religious and spiritual kind of traditions, not in the kind of simplistic way that they've been used by institutions and states to oppress people, but that this is a resource. These are technologies that can be resources for us now, that actually we need them. We actually really need them. And so this has been, I think for me, really interesting to think and to read. I did not know. I knew from our previous discussions that there would be something very interesting to explore and understand more about the historic meaning of the ghost dance in resistance to settler colonialism in this context. And I have to say, reading some of these, accounts has really reinforced my sense that um, that could be very powerful and important for decolonizing, in this context again, because what I see with the way in which aspects of indigenous traditions have been appropriated. It's odd because on the modern kind of left, at least in a place like Canada or certain kind of lefty liberal sorts of circles, almost the only space that they are willing to kind of accredit and acknowledge some kind of like spiritual kind of, as in like, smudging, or these circles of like, the peace pipe, and these kinds of things, they will allow in a land acknowledgement or some kind of like managed situation for the purpose of legitimizing institutions, whether it's the university or the state or something. They will allow a space for that, to have an elder come and do that. And it's always puzzled me, why can they see that this might be something that you should acknowledge, tolerate, understand? But of course, it's because for them, it's kind of actually a settler colonial appropriation in a performance, in order to avoid the actual genuine politics of decolonization. But what I, feel and wonder, and this is, for you and your community and allies, to kind of consider with you, is like, what would it take to revive these as genuinely radical traditions in a culture of resistance that taps into those histories that are still there, were so powerful, um, and avoid this kind of appropriative, performative thing that reinforces the settler colonial state that they're willing in this era. What they banned them in the past, right, which caused this, rebellion, taking place. They banned them in the past because they feared them. What is happening now that they don't fear them to the same extent, or they feel like there's a way that they can be incorporated or validated, but not in the sort of, that there is a radicality there that just needs to be tapped into. And so that's to me, I think, one of the tasks ahead is where we can tap into these sources and resources and technologies, as you put it, um, for reviving our own, um, defiance and resistance, to the colonial order. And that's something I'm going to continue to be thinking about, and I just am so appreciative of the opportunity to learn more from you about these indigenous traditions, and to be thinking about, in a self-critical and historical way, about my own and the ways in which these might intersect and overlap and be sharing together certain kinds of features, that, if we identify them, can become even more useful as resources in our
Mm.
struggles.
That's the title of the Substack. Red Scare makes settlers afraid again. Just kidding. Just kidding. I really appreciate you taking the time on. This is a really wonderful conversation. I'm sure we'll have many more. I'm still trying to sort of wrap my head around how to approach some of these questions in ways that don't sort of like lend themselves to this kind of fetishism by
Yeah.
politicizing them constantly. And I think about one thing, this, I read this article, I didn't share it with you, but I read this article about the ghost dance, and how the ghost dance was really a form of what they called the cry dance or the mourning dance.
Hmm.
And so, like, how the practice of this ghost dance was actually a form of mourning, and how mourning became a form of resistance, because we
Yeah.
were not, I mean, there's the other aspect of it is that you, even our funerary practices were banned. And
That's been
so,
the
Matt,
case in a lot of colonial contexts,
right?
because they're public gatherings of people in a very intense and emotional time, and that's unpredictable. You don't know which way it could go. Just the same way Friday prayers under the Crusaders were, like,
Hmm.
banned, because you get all these Muslims together and they're speaking in Arabic. You don't know what they're saying, and maybe they will be organizing to throw off the Crusaders and get rid of them. And just like what you were saying, is that they didn't understand, but any indigenous people speaking together must be conspiring to overthrow us. So let's make that fear real. I mean, that's the thing to do.
Yeah. So I just thought that was an interesting kind of, I wanted to add that earlier, because it's like, even, the act of remembering, we used to do this with people who were victims of police murder and homicide, the act of remembering, because they're never allowed, they weren't dignified even in life. We should dignify people in life, but in death, it's like they have to be forgotten, and they're not just like, to kind of evoke Gaza, they're not just numbers, they're actual people who
Oh,
deserve to be honored.
look at how disturbing, the funeral of Sheikh
Right.
Syed Hassan Nasrallah
You're
was
right.
to people, 1 million, 2 million people in Beirut, remembering the martyr. Like, it was scary for them
Hmm.
to think there's this kind of possible mobilization that is resistant to our designs for their future. I mean,
Yeah, they had to buzz it with fighter jets,
yeah.
because it's even the act of mourning is a political hostile, or read as a hostile sort of act. And so, yeah, I was just thinking about that in the context of this. But this is a good place to end it. Adnan, really appreciate it. Thank you for taking the time. Check out your podcast, your platform. Again, much appreciated. Wopila Tonka, thank you so much.
Thank you. It was wonderful to be with you, Nick. Salam to you and to all your listeners on Red Scare.